The most important thing, in my view, that can happen for the preservation of the West and its values is for the U.S. military to be by far the best in the world.
CEO and co-founder.
Lonsdale, the founding partner of
Palantir co-founder. Lonsdale.
Alex is one of my favorite people. He's one of the most interesting minds I've met in the world. He's a leader in business. He's a philosopher. He's also going to share a lot of his backstory that people haven't heard before in public. You know, it's really exciting to talk to Alex about Palantir. Palantir is unique in that it's 20 years old, but it's doing some of the most important innovative work in the world right now. Some of the new stuff they're doing in AI, you have to check out. It's really extraordinary. Probably the most important AI company in the world. It's very rare to see this kind of innovation from a company that's 20 years in. It's already had such a big impact globally. Really excited for you to get to know our leader and CEO there, Alex Karp. Today I'm with my friend Alex Karp, the co-founder and CEO of Palantir. Alex, thanks for joining us for the show.
Very happy to be here, Joe. We have a long and windy road together, and it's been great to have you part of my life.
Well, let's start with the big picture. You know, Palantir, we talked a lot about different philosophy that you do teach us, and we talked about dialectics. And one of the animating dialectics is, you know, between pessimism and optimism. And what's the best case for an optimistic view for the United States right now?
You know, America produces crazy, outside the norm people that are driven. We're not constrained the way other cultures are by intergenerational risk taking. So, I mean, it's proverbial, you're allowed to fail here. It's a banality, but it really is true. We push responsibility in all contexts, generally to people who are first generation achievers. So that is very different than other cultures. Perhaps there's some good and bad facts around that, but we really do reward outside the traditional, the short version would be outside the box, thinking whatever the box means, more than other cultures. We have a deep and very, very successful culture of sophisticated technical accomplishment, especially on the West Coast, born out of universities, but then financed in a way in which there is at least as much alignment as humanly possible between entrepreneur and investor. They're obviously not always complete alignment, and we on the entrepreneurial side, you've been on both sides, but there are obviously issues there. The tech community on the West Coast of America is more important than all other communities combined in the world. That's kind of rolls off the lips easily, but we forget how important that is. We still are a beacon for the most talented people in the world to come here. Our educational institutions, and in our general culture of cooperation, one of the most valuable and least read books, partly because I'm not sure it's in English, is this book by Plesner, who is a philosophical anthropologist, which is a way of saying he was talking about structures that are pre-cultural that impact human behavior. It was about how America allows you to choose the community you're in, but then the rules of that community apply to you. So in Europe, for example, the state decides which church, what synagogue, what mosque is actually real. Like when you start a company here, you start your own culture. And then I think all of these things cascade together. So if you're sitting in any part of the world and you want to do something interesting, your number one choice right now, without a good choice number two, is to come to the U.S. and build it. And I would say on top of everything else, for all the class issues we have in this country, we are very forgiving of successful people. You know, it's in most cultures, success could land you in a very first generational success is very dangerous. And I that's just a limited list. I think America And then, like, if you wanted to do a simple reductionist version of this, you could say, well, why are almost all software products in the enterprise context built in one part of the world? Well, it's very hard to answer the question, but it is true. And if you went to any country besides the US and said, could we have 10% of that? They would do really anything to have it. But it's a mystery how we continue to do this. And so we're so successful at this that we don't even notice it, and then we're very focused on the things we're less successful at, like making our highways and schools and other things run, our healthcare system. We can go back, you can go do a diagnostic on why, and there'd probably be disagreement between us on the why, but it is true that we're just the best in the world at a certain set of things, and we're not the best in the world at others. And we're very focused in America on that, and that obfuscates that without, I had a slight advantage that I spent so much time abroad that when you kind of re-immigrate back to America, you see these things in a more wondrous way than maybe if you're looking at some of the things that really are below the, say, European standard.
Let's go with it. I want to hear a little bit more about your background for everyone, Alex. Where did you grow up, and how did you become an entrepreneur?
I think my road to being an entrepreneur, broadly defined, so building things. Now, I would define my role as building things that transform key aspects of society. That's what we built at Palantir. It's software as a transforming engine. Really began with, like many things, something I didn't want and was not overly forward about in public, which was my dyslexia, which I hid. So I was very good at certain things, and I would say still am, that other people are not as good at. I legitimately saw the world differently. My brain was structured differently than other people, and I was able to perform at a professional level in certain areas, even as a young kid, but then really was hindered in other areas. And we had this weird family structure where my mom was in grad school as an artist, and everybody was an artist, so they were outside the norm. It was a heavily Jewish environment. My mom is black. We were pro-Israel, and super erudite, heavily Jewish environment. Everything about my life was further outside the norm than I realized.
It's like extreme outsider for in a lot of ways.
There's no insider bias with that. Yeah. I would have loved to be an insider somewhere, and the minute I could be an insider, I'm like, shit, I'm dyslexic. So it's like, I used to wonder as a little kid, how could this get worse? I was like, but, it's like, I mean, not in a sense that I was, thought that it was bad, but I was like, this is just like, and I always thought from the beginning, and this is why, despite what people thought about Palantir sometimes, I view Palantir as a civil liberties juggernaut. That doesn't mean everyone in the civil liberties community will ever agree with us, but I always thought if fascism comes, I will be the first or second person on the wall.
Because you're like the most outside, who they're going to target.
There's and this is before I had tendies. So now I was like, no matter what happens, if something goes wrong in society, I'm done for. And America's changed a lot, but it just in every environment I went into. But on the other hand, I was also a deep insider. So it's this insider outsider. My family is just so highly educated. Mm-hmm. So it's not just the case that I was an outsider, but I was an insider in terms of understanding art, science, to some extent math through my father, but anything historical or cultural through my mom. I mean, I spent every weekend in museums, at cultural events. It took a decade after leaving home, before I could even go to a museum, because we just had to spend so much time. And so that insider of what I would call the fundamental structures of Western thought and art, which I then later refined in grad school, but while simultaneously not belonging, but at the same time believing, and I believe this still, the only way in which non-belonging people belong is in the context of a Western society that protects the rule of law, that protects the right of free expression, that protects your property rights, that de facto protects unpleasant people. Like our societies are still the best, though flawed, at protecting people who are unpopular because of their views, because of their habits, because of who they are, and that resonates with me on all fronts. And in fact, and then who make people, because I can see myself in all those people.
And so how did this lead? You went to law school and you got a PhD in philosophy. Why law school and philosophy?
I mean, law school was, I thought I could actually help people with a law degree. What I discovered quickly is it's hard to help people if you have no interest in what you're doing. So that was this weird thing where a lot in business, one of my theories is a lot of the best decisions happen for the wrong reasons. Like I had a reason for going to law school. It made no sense. Mm-hmm. But I spent a lot of time fighting with Peter about political issues, and that made a lot of sense.
Peter Thiel is in your class at law school at Stanford.
Yeah, and we were in the same dorm and in the same section, and we both had heterogeneous, non-conformant views, his leaning to the right, mine more classically, but not completely classically on the left. I spent no time doing anything there except for reading books and running into people and arguing with them, Peter being the primary one. And so that made a lot. Later, the Stanford thing really, Stanford is the premier university for tech in the world.
It is what connected all of us, I guess, ultimately in the end.
Yeah. The Stanford is a fascinating institution in and of itself, but it is the tech university of the world. And I didn't think of it that way when I went there. I certainly it was not at all part of my thinking. It also made me think I should go do something I wanted to do because I was unhappy there. And what I wanted to do was write about basically Germanic post-war thought in whatever field. I didn't really care that much, but I didn't want to do a PhD in the US because that would have meant doing a master's degree and doing 3 years of regurgitation. It's like I've already had a 3-year bid.
Got it.
Like I don't want to, I've escaped my 3-year bid. I want to go do what I want to do.
And you ended up studying under Habermas. Was he somebody you'd studied previously? You were excited to work with?
The longer version is I went over to study with him. I was in his colloquium and I studied with him. And then we had a falling out, and then I finished my PhD with someone else. But not on bad terms. It's just I discovered while writing my PhD that the stakes were very low and the personalities were very difficult. And I also discovered, partly in proximity to him, but in proximity to other people who were kind of world class, one meeting with Luhmann, watching debates between Habermas and Appel, people came to the colloquium in Habermas, that I had certain abilities they didn't have to like be a builder. Mm-hmm. And while I was good enough to be in the room with them and argue with them on where I was a technical expert, dedicating myself to reading and writing all day was not what I wanted. And they did not seem to understand. I wouldn't have put it in these terms because I hadn't built anything, but they didn't have the right personality for building.
Yeah. Well, there's a certain, from the business world perspective, there's a certain dysfunction to a lot of the smartest academics, that they're very good at some things, but they can never come out into what we see as the real world. I guess for them, that they're in their own real world.
Yeah, this is true. I would say, in fairness to people at the level of like Appel, Habermas, Luhmann, and others that I ran into. Bella came to gave a speech at Harvard. I think they would have succeeded at anything.
Really?
There is a there is a level. Now maybe it would have to be low on human management, but there are entrepreneurs who are low on human management.
They're just so smart. They'd iterate and figure it out with their wisdom.
The level of talent that just take Nicholas Luhmann, who's it wouldn't be for the audiences probably the most important thinker of social thought post World War II. Wrote more than most of us read in a life, and developed this kind of theory, systems theory, which was a way of explaining how humans and systems function. That basically is, if you were only reading one thing, you would read this. One of the really important things about working with people at that level is you're working with people at that level. There's just a way in which the gears are different. And while I don't think they would build or run Palantir particularly well, I do think that they could materially advance an institution. They might have to have someone below them who could actually interact with the people, but these are people who are, just like when we were building Palantir together, our engineers.
Yeah, the very best in the world.
The very, very best in the world are, the brain structure is different. And one of the things that our institutions underestimate, but we have an advantage in America because we have this tech scene, is the people think that there's they're with a standard deviation of the best if you're the second best, but it's not. It's just a different universe. It's not true. Yeah. And you see this in software and building software products. The very best in the world, the people who built PG, the brain structure, the way of solving problems, it is not at all similar to how, I don't want to mention their last names because I think one of them is happily not famous. But,
I think a picture comes out for him when he searches him online.
On PG with Bob, there are very few people who could have pulled that off. And I think and I would say, if you took Ryan and Bob and put them in an academic context, I don't think Bob McGrew minds. I'll leave Ryan's last name out, but they would do very, very well.
Yeah, well, Bob obviously went on to OpenAI to do very important work there. It's an interesting point about talent that I think you framed it in a way that was very helpful to think about, that you actually have to be within a couple standard deviations to even appreciate this. And so I think a big problem with a lot of our institutions, for example, around the Pentagon, is if you have people who are only one standard deviation above, they can't even tell a difference between 4 and 5. And they have no idea what's even going on at those levels. So you need people who are good enough to even appreciate that.
We have a huge advantage, and let's just take U.S. commercial. This is a really true thing and really not understood, that to appreciate talent, you need to be within standard deviation of that talent. Unless you have some specialized weird, this is where, for whatever reason, I think I have some kind of weird ability where, I have picked some of the best and managed some of the best engineers in the world consistently. Larger institutions struggle in some cases because they think they can't tell the difference between.
Well, I think it's almost like those cultures reject these people who are extremely good, right?
But but again, to your American optimism thing, which I share, and we have a culture that nurtures them, allows them to be managed, provides capital, teaches them. One of the things I think people get wrong is you don't learn to win by failing. You learn to win by working with people who have ups and downs and then win. Yeah. So there's a deep understanding, whether they work with you at 8VC or they work with others, some of whom I like and some of whom I don't, but you do learn what it means to build business. And in the American commercial context, especially, you have this high turnover. So it's like people really do, the people running these institutions on the tech side, 5 years ago, CIOs didn't buy our product. Now they do, because there's this plasticity of learning in the U.S., which is something that I think other countries struggle with. That it is true that identifying the difference between, Bob and Ryan and any very strong normal engineer is something that takes specialized. Quite frankly, I think it's very similar to music. Very few people can hear the blue note. Almost no one can play it. to be what we do in tech is we hear the blue note on the tech talent side, which very few people, it's like you roll 3 crazy people into a room and a very talented normal person will pick the one person who's moderately talented. Whereas if you roll those 3 people into Palantir or to your VC, we'll be like, no, we want that one. And that's great. Then you have to be able to manage that person. That's also...
Basically, that's like my karma to have to manage these people now after you had to deal with us when we were kids. So that's how we're doing it.
Well, I have a lot of stories about our times together. Our times together are some of the best of my life.
Oh. So, well, Alex, you said you left academia in part because it was a bit self-gratifying. You said earlier, and so obviously you had this skill. You could be a builder. Academia wasn't where you wanted to be. Like how do you transition into the business world?
By the way, this is your podcast about me and not about you. But one of the things I always admired about Joe, Joe is the most loyal person on the planet, and sometimes you have to fight and you're wrong.
You could be loyal and wrong though too.
No, Joe. It's like so. Those a lot of our fighting for justice and winning. Joe is spearheaded,
right.
And.
It's been a mistake where I've been too loyal and I've kept people I shouldn't have around in certain positions. It's very hard to get this right. So I appreciate that.
Well, it's a mistake that we all at Palantir enjoyed you having. And our times getting Palantir off the ground were just crazy magical, dangerous, scary. We almost went out of business a lot of times. And in fact, except for the fact that we were so maniacally focused on getting this thing to work, it would never have worked because no one wanted to invest in us. All the top VCs were like, it's a crazy idea to be interested in data, working with large institutions.
We did have a little bit of an attitude that I think you and I shared, which was like the famous, Kid Timus, Caesar Vius, which is, why are you afraid? Like you're carrying the people who are going to be successful, right? To the famous boatman with Julius Caesar. There's something like that, which I don't think it was necessarily arrogance. It was just a sense that we had to win.
Maybe, look, I think we were arrogant, but in some ways, in some places we were too arrogant. In some places we weren't arrogant enough.
That's fair.
Like, if we had gone into the VCs and been like, "Fuck you, we're gonna win," they probably would have given us money.
Do you have any favorite stories from some of those VC meetings?
We had so many, but obviously the most famous.
Too many.
The most famous is we're at like the most famous VC, and like we're in the last round, and the most important partner just like spent his time doodling. My fantasy of it is he was doodling some erotic little picture that he was, fixated on. But, but in non-fairness to that person, I think if we had stood up and walked out, we're like, fuck this, you guys are wasting our time. Chances of them investing would have been much higher. One of the things that entrepreneurs or builders need to understand about the Valley is if you're not overtly aggressive about representing yourself, they'll just assume that, it's not real. And we were ironically too modest with those people. However, and then sometimes too arrogant with like government people and others where we're like...
me as a 22-year-old was probably not the right person to sell to the government. That was complicated, but yeah.
But in fairness to us, the government has changed a lot. I mean, there's a lot of problems and I have some ideas of how to fix them, but we were the first to break in. And it's like a lot of other companies have now come in, and some are doing very well.
No, I'm able to do a lot in defense now, thanks to Palantir, then SpaceX and others, right? And,
we showed up, we succeeded, which again, none of this matters if you're like some academic project, you don't succeed. We sued the government not to buy our product, but to ensure that people bought products that worked, because the most important thing, in my view, that can happen for the preservation of the West and its values is for the U.S. military to be by far the best in the world.
What are a couple things they could do to fix it and be better? Obviously, they've changed, they've improved. Like, what do you want to see them do?
They've changed, they've improved. There's just, in business, it's really important to go back to like things that are kind of obvious. But one of the obvious things that's not part of every structure of the U.S. government is almost all enterprise software that works in America or in the world has 2 characteristics. It's built in America and it's built as a product.
Yep.
And it has a third characteristic, quite frankly, that it's sold commercially. So if you just say, the rebuttable presumption is, if a product is world-class, it is A, built in America. Again, rebuttable doesn't always mean, but very likely. It is, you could get drilled down on that, it's built by this, but just, it is a product, and somebody commercially has bought that product.
Yeah.
It is very non-plausible that you would have the best software product in the world and you've never sold it commercially, because you don't have time to make your company be worth $50 billion. It is not a product. Okay, so that means you will never scale it. And by the way, that also, there's a lot there because you want the world's best engineers to work on something, the ones that can do things no one else can. Tell them you want to not build products and see how far that goes.
Yeah.
And again, for reasons that are complicated and hard to understand, it almost as invariably is built in America, most likely on the West Coast, but not exclusively on the West Coast anymore. Okay, we know this to be true. The US government should have a policy where a small percent of all, especially the DoD, a small percent of its spend has to go to products built in the software built in the United States that is a product that has been proven both on the battlefield and has been in some derivative sold commercially.
But the insiders are all doing like cost plus contracts, right? So, and they're still doing that.
If you want to reform an institution, you've got to start by reforming parts of it. So I would just say, starting now, 1% has to go for this. 1% of $900 billion is roughly the budget. It's like, and then every 6 months, it goes up by 1%. Or you could even say every year, because in the end, and by the way, that would change the number of people selling to the DoD, because even now, I'm sure there are like a lot more people. When we were building Palantir, I'm glad the VCs have changed. I'm glad the culture in Silicon Valley now can either be interested in helping the DoD or as likely pretend they're interested. But in fairness, one of the things that stops even more investment is there's these long time cycles, and it's not clear that your product isn't going to be outbought by someone providing a service. By the way, services things tend not to work.
Early on, when we were trying to sell the government, the services things would capture like the vast majority of the revenue, and they'd toss us like a really tiny piece, and that was the only way you get in. And I was talking to people today, and obviously people in the government have realized that we work. Some of those services companies just seem extremely jealous of Palantir. It's like we thought they were dumb, and apparently they think we're bad or something like that. And I'm wondering, is it because they're jealous? I think there's just some huge jealousy with. I mean, I shouldn't mention the names of these companies, but these big companies that would do all the ontologies, and get paid tens of millions of dollars for something useless. And I think there seems like an extreme jealousy or something from the outsiders.
Look, you're a warrior for justice, and I am in a different way a fighter for Western values. If you want to reform these institutions, the best thing is to not engage in why they may like us, we may not like them, but to say it is clearly in the best interest for the country that produces this unique thing. By the way, the thing that is the most valuable thing in the world that no other country is producing.
We should be using that in the DoD.
There should just be a minimal part of the budget. And it's minimal. It's 1%. By the way, the other thing we need to do is every single thing that is not being presented to people at any level that is not actually running on real data, there should be a flag. This is a video.
Yeah.
Because what you'll see across large institutions, not just the DoD, but commercial institutions, that people get presented things that are literally videos.
Yeah, they're fake.
So it's like, well, maybe someday they'll work, but it's very purely intuitively, it's very hard. It does not correspond to anything that people believe, because you would think 5,000 people being paid $1 billion would produce something more valuable than 5 people working for equity, just purely intuitively. But it's not true.
Yeah.
So
it used to be true with like maybe tanks or something, but it's not true with software.
Well, one of our advantages in software is that the hardware cultures are really struggle with software, because these things are true for tanks and they're true for other things and big metal things. They're not true for software. But again, it's also true that software is the most important asset, and our adversaries are going to be much better at building these big metal things than they are at software. But to this point, the way to reform the system is say a certain percentage that's small must go to these things.
I love it. That's a great point.
And then the second thing is, just as an addendum, when you show off, if the products are working, the financing should be triggered at some point. It was like, oh, it worked.
Yep.
And last,
pay for it for working, not pay for it for just.
and last not least, there should just be a minor thing in every bill. Oh, by the way, we are going to flag every time something is a video and not working, so that every senior and by the way, every institution, not just every institution in the world, should have a mandate. It's like it's okay to do things that are notionalized or things you're going to build in the future. That's part of innovation.
But be honest about what's live.
But you have to force honesty on your institution, because otherwise, again, to the beginning of this, people will buy from the people that they like, that are like them. And sometimes that's valuable in the people. But in software, a lot of times you're buying something from the freak show and it works. And the future of the West depends on buying things from people that are sometimes, not always, outside the norm, unlikable to you, are not going to conform to your thing, are not going to the right dinners.
Are you calling us unlikable, Alex?
I'm not calling, I like myself. I'm just saying.
Otherwise, the insiders always win every time.
And look, the thing about reform is that you're going to blow up the institution doesn't work either. You've got to say, we're going to pick here. And then the institution, especially in America, will adapt, because once you see a tiny sliver is going to this thing,
it's working.
People are like, but it not only works, it's the best in the world. This thing is scaring our enemies.
Yeah.
You know, Americans right now are very motivated inside the DoD to scare our enemies.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what scares our enemies. Using software that is actually a product that's almost invariably built here, and that someone on this planet has actually paid for commercially.
So speaking of that, let's move on to AI, because this is obviously tied into this. You said recently, Alex, that some tech leaders are calling for an AI pause because they don't have a product ready. How much of AI right now is innovation in theater? What's real and what's hype? What should we be paying attention to?
Well, the big thing that we have to avoid in our country, but there's less of a problem for us than in other countries, is there's just an attempt to dampen AI and its utilization by people who don't have a product. And that is like, this is actually a big deal inside and outside of government. Now, luckily for us in this country, it's a much smaller deal than, say, in Europe, where it's like, you know, there's all these discussions, some of which I very much support and some of which we can power. Where does the data go? How does it used? Where does it flow? What is in the algorithm? Is the algorithm discriminatory? Mm-hmm. But some of it is, you'd say in German, vorgeschoben, which means kind of just put out there as a theatrical thing, because there aren't really that many. There are some companies providing AI in the form of advanced machine learning or large language models. We have a slight bias here at Palantir. We build a software that will allow you to process large language models, rebuild the output of large language models, turn it into what we call an agent, which is a safe algorithm you can run across your enterprise, and we can interact back and forth with large language models or other forms of AI, so that the algorithm of large model understands your enterprise, but you don't outsource the knowledge of your enterprise to the large language model. So I believe that will be the future, and that these things, implemented correctly, large language models and AI are a crazy advantage over people who don't. And you could just take very simple examples on margins in business, efficiency and allocation, resource allocation, rebuilding your enterprise so that you get the most efficient parts at the right time, allocation of assets, resources, figuring out, by the way, one of the most important uses of AI for America that we're just beginning to see, which we're seeing at a company I won't mention just because I haven't, but like manufacturing, often manufacturing has a cultural element. So if you want to manufacture something in America like is manufactured in Japan or Taiwan, that's actually a really hard thing to do. But one of the things algorithms and AI will allow you to do is control the instruments, control production, so that you get an American workforce, the advantages of being in the US, and production exactly like you would have in Japan or in Taiwan or other places. And so that is not theater. That is, and by the way, the part that's definitely not theater is you're going to watch the GDP of America compared to the world.
This is what I also wanted to ask you about, because it does seem to me like it could affect productivity, right, which is the input to GDP. And in America, productivity in things like healthcare, education even areas, if we disagree on politics, we can both agree those are very important to work better for our country. Like productivity stagnated in those areas for decades. Is AI finally going to break in and maybe help productivity there? Are we going to be able to fix some things?
We have a lot of we had no clients in leave education. We're not heavily involved in that. But on healthcare, pharmaceuticals, hospital care, we had basically very few clients last year. And now I think we power allocation at between 13 and 14% of all hospital bed allocation in the country.
Wow.
We have, and it's simply because the people in these industries know that they need instruments to increase efficiency and productivity. Part of the reason why it was hard to do this is the use case they have is very difficult because you have to increase productivity with low margins under harsh conditions, meaning you can get sued, you do get sued. There are privacy protections that are the most sacrosanct in the world. There are issues around resource allocation that involve class and race. Which mean that
I don't want to touch those.
So those are issues. Those are issues that where you need to be able to track what goes into the algorithm, how the algorithm is used, and how that algorithm then leads back to efficiency without getting into hot water either morally, institutionally, or legally. Palantir is ideal for that.
Yeah.
And so. But again, it's precisely because one of the amazing things in business is no one believes that that Palantir's deep understanding of the technical issues that involve data protection, civil liberties, are things that generated our product. Yes, but if you're dealing with this use case, there's only one engine you can use because we've spent 20 years thinking and building products for this. And interestingly, it's the kind of things you use to identify adversaries with software also presuppose a data protection, civil liberties bias. It's not just find enemy, it's find enemy, is this the stupid general we want to keep alive, or is this the general that's smart?
Okay, speaking of that, we got to talk about Ukraine then. Speaking of stupid generals to keep alive, that's great. Let's change gears to that. You were the first Western CEO to visit Zelensky in Ukraine. I thought that was a very bold thing to do. It was very, very cool. You went over there very quickly. Can you paint a picture of Ukraine's capabilities pre and post Palantir?
In the Ukraine stuff, I have to be super general, both because every government, but first of all, and again, this is what I should say, but it also is true. The Ukrainians are courageous in a way that it's almost unfathomable when you're sitting here, you meet people who are going into battle. The Ukrainian people, and I realize there's a lot of debate in our country, and I welcome debate as a kind of very much on the side of the First Amendment and kind of all the way up to it being as expansive as it can be.
We used to have this debate inside of Palantir, by the way, early on a lot of issues, right? So that's something it was always part of the culture.
The right to express yourself, including things that will upset other people, is core to a functioning democracy. Yeah. And, the fact that you're being offended shows you're living in a democracy. Yeah. And that's, I try to empathize with the other side of that issue. Because I think you have to steel man all these arguments. But in the end, once you, the rights you give up will be used against you. Yeah. And that's something that, it does place a high burden on people who have to listen to speech that they find offensive. And I engage all the way to the margin and engage with people whose speech I find offensive. And I talk to all sorts of people in all sorts of small rooms where, by the way, there's a bobcat behind you.
Oh, wow.
A really nice.
That's a cool bobcat.
You guys should get that on film.
That's from the national.
That is
park.
Nuts.
Alex always lives in the most interesting areas. See how peaceful wildlife. Look at it! Wow.
That is it's like a mini tiger.
Wow. That is. Have you seen that here, Lutz?
It's here to honor you, Joe. I've never seen it before.
It's a good omen for us, Alex. In Ukraine, you went to these people, saw
Oh, no.
people in small
So
rooms.
they usually, when you go, I've spent 20 years going to important institutions of all kinds, and there is often, but not always, a moment where you're in a small room with someone, and they're like, "Yeah, but the truth is, I don't agree with so and so. I don't believe. I think my leader is beyond or something."
Yeah.
There was none of that. Like the amount of kind of deep patriotism, and again, I'm talking about all sorts of people. I like talking to people, quite frankly, who are unimportant. So I mean, I have a kind of honor to meet lots of important people.
And this is not because they're afraid of expressing a different viewpoint. It's
The Ukrainians are. It is not a place where people are particularly afraid of expressing any viewpoint.
That's true.
You are going to hear a lot of free speech. They are fighting because they believe, and you can debate a lot of things, and there's a healthy debate about the Ukraine war in this country, but I can tell you from my experience on the ground, these people are fighting, and they are willing to fight. And, at a general level, without going into details, some of the places that have used our product have been bombed. People have died. And the same day, those people are back at work.
Wow.
Same day. It's like, and they're also very, very technical.
At a high level, what's Palantir able to do that other systems are not able to
So
do?
as a
on
matter,
the ground there?
Palantir is useful for the Ukraine. Some of it's the part that's public is obviously documenting war crimes, but war crimes are hard to document because of data protection issues, to take it to court, where the evidence come from, who's touched it, chain of custody issues. So that's kind of we're doing. Understanding who's doing what on the other side is a classic use case for PG. So how is the adversary, how as a matter of theory, you can just go through the products. So there's a kind of the civilian prosecution, there's in the PG Foundry constellation, there's an ability to understand what the adversary is doing kind of with their operatives, who's doing what, how is doing it, with segmented data access, which is crazy important in the war. But it's funny is that people don't understand you need segmented or high data protection because the knowledge that these people have is so valuable, meaning people will die if it gets out, that you have to control who sees what. Gaia, meaning who is it will allow you on the battlefield to be able to see where in real time, what plan out your battle, attack, retreat, understand the adversary. And then the most powerful use of our product currently, and again, of one of our products, is being able to identify an adversary over a large line mass using AI. And that obviously it's been reported has led to a different level of ability to acquire the adversary's position.
Yep.
And there are so many lessons that we need to learn in this country, and we'll learn. But one of the obvious lessons is we are in a software world. It was the case that this was the ramblings of a couple people 20 years ago that people didn't think should have been in this business, including you and me and our other co-founders and early employees. It's just a banality. And the other thing is our adversaries now are awake. China and Russia realize this. They didn't realize it before.
Yeah.
And that is going to change where they invest their money. And we'll give them ability to catch up if we're not on top of this.
Well, this was a thesis 20 years ago. Is this would clearly become by far the most important part of the defense world, which it seems to have become now. It's a little scary that they're aware of it too, but it's nice to have a lead for now. Zooming out a little bit, I want to ask about Silicon Valley before we end. You said our problem in the West is not technological; it's organizational. And can you expound on that? And is that true of the government and technology? How do you think about that?
Again, we build these crazy valuable things. We build them in a way no one else builds them, with like tiny groups of exactly the right people managed aggressively against a goal that could take years, where we split the proceeds pretty equitably across the people who build it, and where people can be involved. And from the outside, we have a general culture that embraces that, extends it, tries to insert that into institutions with all its flaws and there are many, and we've lived under those flaws, that is unlike any other in the world. But we obviously could become much more efficient. And then we are also very misaligned on some of these issues. We have a significant number of people in the West who believe if we disarmed, the world would be a better place. This is a belief structure that, in my view, is theological in the sense the assumptions can never be problematized because there's no evidence this is true ever in the history of humanity. But it does conform to the way we would like the world to be. I would like the world to be. It also conforms to a certain derivative of our philosophical and religious systems. It also happens to be completely untrue.
Yeah.
And so those of us who want to believe that you will get a better world, not a perfect world, but a better world by making Western institutions, especially the United States of America, stronger, especially on the battlefield, we confront an ideological system that will never agree with us. They confront a reality that will never conform to their views. And we as a culture have to navigate that. Now, I do think Russia and China's actions in the last 5 years have made it much harder. And even in Silicon Valley,
it's woken up everyone, right? They actually all want to do defense with us now. This is very funny because even when I was starting a new defense thing 7-8 years ago, people were like, "You're kind of quirky. I thought you weren't doing that anymore after Palantir. Like, why would you do defense?" And they still didn't get it. But I think now people actually get it a little more.
Well, one of the ways that our lives have changed is 20 years ago, this was like from Mars freak show. All these views, the West must defend itself. The people producing this thing called software must be aligned with our government. We should not allow software institutions, to sell to our adversaries, but not sell to the U.S. government. The world will become disjointed and more violent. Simultaneously, startups would rise and become a very large in terms of market cap and footprint, and that these software companies, Palantir, and I hope others someday, will change the course of history as you've seen, and are in ways that no one believes, or some ways that are classified, and that, but simultaneously, and that you can get people to believe by seeing the success and the impact, and last not least, and our adversaries will completely act up, because without them acting up, I still think people would not believe us. We've come closer to the norm.
Yeah.
And so like now all these things are like you walk around and people are, I don't think everyone's saying believes it, but they are beginning, and you know, and that's kind of very gratifying. And it's probably good that they've forgotten that they all called us assholes 20 years ago.
It was really interesting to live knowing, obviously Palantir had helped stop some really major attacks that were not public, and people just thought we were weird and didn't appreciate it. And so it's interesting, you're finally getting some public appreciation, I guess, after maybe not for everything we've done, but for some of the new things.
Well, a lot of things we've done can never be publicized. And I do in some ways wish they were more well known, both for Palantirians and because these institutions that I revere, like our military institutions and others, would get even more support if people understood the impact they were having in clandestine services, positive impact. Now, there are reasons they can't talk about these things and probably shouldn't. It has changed from we are like essentially the X-Men in a very deep cave and then being shuffled back into the cave and told, but there's still a lot of that. Like, I always get in trouble for saying the obvious fact that without PG, Europe would be completely different politically.
Oh yeah.
And this is just a fact.
I think U.S. might be as well. We probably shouldn't talk too much about this because you don't see it as big of a problem. But I mean, I think a lot of the battles we're having, there are cultural wars right now over things, might not be the battles we'd be having if there'd been multiple successful attacks, right? I think the culture could have transformed in a very different direction.
Yes. America is, there's a lot that has gone into the some of the luxuries we have, including certain dialogues that are clearly luxury product.
So, Alex, we started American Optimist to push back against cynicism and pessimism you've seen in a lot of parts of our country. What innovations and breakthroughs make you most excited about the next 20 years? What gives you hope for the next few decades?
America is by far the best at enterprise software. You saw this before AI and large language models. I think at this point, it's kind of hard to ignore. We continue to attract and retain the best talent in the world. We have cultural systems for managing that talent and turning that into productive companies like some of the ones you support and finance, and I would say most notably Palantir. I think a lot of the kind of, and then we have, there's a way in which our adversaries who are really focused on hurting us galvanize and bring the best out of America and allow us, in many cases, to look past divisions that are quite obviously less important than us unifying to outmaneuver and be stronger than our adversaries and leave them so scared that they act up less and quiver at the idea that rule of law, free speech, protection of property, and in general respect of humans is a basic human right.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great note to end it on. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.